Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Lex Poll webinar, The Future of EMS, Insights and Next Steps from ESO Research. We're going to be getting started in just a minute or so here. We want to thank our sponsors for today's webinar, ESO. They've been really great partnering with us in getting today's event together, so we appreciate their sponsorship of today's event. So you can see a link to their homepage there on the bottom of your screen in the lower left, so go ahead and check that out if you would be so kind. And again, thanks to ESO for being here with us today as our sponsor. All right, we have two presenters here with us today. First, we're going to introduce Pat Thompson. And in her 15 years with ESO, Pat has led and mentored a team of 40-plus trainers, implementation specialists, and managers to consistently deliver a robust training and implementation program for multiple products, growing the team from just 2 people to about 100 customers. She has led the integration of multiple teams, employees, and products through 7 company acquisitions. She has also guided the design, development, and implementation of programs, strategies, and frameworks to support stronger alignment across internal and external teams, overcoming a complex strategic challenges. Pat helped to establish the ESO Training Academy, including core curriculum design and logistical planning, which has been going strong for over 5 years now. As a licensed paramedic and field supervisor for over 20 years, Pat helped bring the strike team concept to Texas and participated in writing the initial curriculum for this course. We've also got Dr. Brent Myers with us here today, and Dr. Myers began his EMS career during high school as an emergency department technician in his hometown of Wilkesboro, North Carolina. The department charge nurse, Geraldine, had a huge influence on Brent's career, reminding him of the rewards that come from helping others. Quote, "If you stick with this for a month, you will want to work in this field for the rest of your life." Brent went on to complete an EMT course and volunteered with Orange County Rescue Squad, the 911 EMS provider in Hillsborough, North Carolina. He currently serves as Chief Medical Officer for ESO, working to innovative and integrate dispatch, fire, EMS, and hospital data in order to improve community health and safety. And at this point, I'm going to turn the floor over to Pat and Brent, our presenters for today. Welcome.
Great. Thanks so much, Stephen. Thanks so much for that kind introduction. Pat and I are going to divide a little bit of this up purposefully, but we're also going to have a conversation as we go along. The first thing we'd like to do is just give a little background on our thought process around how EMS is evolving, how the research that we have conducted is kind of leading us into new and different paths. We're then going to dive into some very specific research around education and dispatch, and Pat's going to lead us through some key components of that. And then finally, we're going to try to kind of demystify a little bit this notion of AI coming into the medical space, and give some hopefully uplifting pointers about how this is going to improve our future rather than be the threat that I think sometimes we find it to be. So with that, I'm going to just jump in and give us just a very brief background and history of where we are and why we're here today. And the first thing I just want to reflect on is this is the setting in which EMS was born. And I promise you, we're not going to start at 1966 and go every year until now. But I think to set the table for some context, the deaths on the highway interstate system, as we all know, is what caused the modern EMS structure in the United States to be born. We learned that there were 1.5 million people killed on the highways in the decade before the 1966 white paper, which is more people than have been killed in all of the wars combined in the States. And so that's where that came from. And you can see here, that just kind of in retrospect, the complete lack of safety that was in these vehicles, right? The non-collapsing steering wheels, the no child seats, the lap belts only, all of the things that led to that formation. So we started here with a paper that just said we need to be able to respond to this in a meaningful way. I'm going to fast forward all the way to the agenda for 2050. And I put this in the context to remind us that our firefighter colleagues, our trauma center colleagues also have plans going forward into the next several decades. But I want us to focus on these EMS principles. And this is kind of the roadmap, if you will, that the thought leaders in our industry have put before us to say by 2050, we should have an EMS system that's adaptable and innovative, it's safe and it's effective, all of these items. And the question that we ask ourselves is, why are we waiting until 2050? What is it that's standing in the way of us being at the EMS agenda for the future sooner? And there's hope and reason that we can be able to achieve this in a more rapid manner. So there's a couple of things that are kind of standing in the way, and Pat's going to cover those on the next couple of slides. So Pat, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. We'll start off by looking at our system design. We have, we know we have a lot of individual experiences through that process and not a lot of shared knowledge or shared understanding. So what we know, we have 10% of the population utilizes the system, right? 10% of the population calls 911 for EMS annually. Of that 10% of these requests actually require ultra time crucial EMS interventions. And of that, 15% of these requests are not associated with ultra time critical hospital admission. So when we look at the way our system is designed, we see, that this piece, that it's designed really for the 10 and 15%. It's not designed, that's for the minority of the work that we accomplish, not the majority of what we do, right? We know that fire first response is overburdened. We know that our resource constraints that we have today is the hospital wait times are long, patient offboarding times are long, our hospital EDs are overburdened, and that's all contributing to the design of the system that we have that's keeping us from being able to move forward there. The second thing is we know that the data that we have collected from these systems live in silos. It's not integrated together. We can't get a full picture. A call comes in for help to the dispatch center. We know that traditional kind of rift between dispatch and the field. Any of us that have lived on either side or both sides of that fence, we know that exists. But it's real. Those gaps are real. The data that comes in, a call comes in, a dispatcher answers that call, enters all the data into their dispatch system. And what we get from that is a brief dispatch code, right? It's better than what we used to have. We know before we had EMD, it was, a fire call, maybe a medical call if we got that, or a police call. So we've made improvements there, but these data still live very much in silos. We get just a brief dispatch code from all that information that's entered. And then from the response, we know that we get just same thing. We give the brief radio report to the hospital, right? And the data doesn't go back and forth. We don't send that back into dispatch or we haven't historically, to really get a good understanding of, performance improvement or quality review on that. And the same thing from our EMS data, the brief radio or phone information that we share with the hospitals, right? It's the same thing. We don't get a lot of that information. Certainly they don't know what we got from dispatch or what the outcome historically was from that report. And that creates these silos and prevents us from being able to really look at the whole picture and understand how to improve the performance in these areas. Brent?
Yeah, thanks, Pat. So I think where that leaves us is this notion of almost the ambulance alone, if you think about it in that way. So the dispatch information sits at the dispatch center, the clinical information sits at the hospital, and we wonder sometimes why EMS is responding to 10% of the population. We're running out of resources, all of these items. And it's because the data are not integrated in the way that they should and could be. And so we're not going to dwell on this negativity part, because the point is we now have identified this, and there are things that we can do proactively today and in the very near future to remove some of these data silos. In other words, we want to break this down. And the way I like to think about it is kind of a goofy animation, but it's one that I really like. We today, sitting here, I think if we all put our brains together, could write down the best care for a cardiac arrest. We could write down the best care for a STEMI, a stroke, a septic patient, infield deliveries, all of the different things that an EMS provider might encounter. We could also probably think about the best way to offer entry to the healthcare system for that vast majority of the patients we encounter who are not having a time critical emergency, as we talked about at the beginning. The problem comes in that we have this shared knowledge amongst us, but when we go out into the field, we have individual experiences. And sometimes those individual experiences are one-offs, or I personally have not delivered a child in the field in a decade. True statement, right? But when the individual provider doesn't have the benefit of their shared knowledge and they're trying to rely only on their own individual experiences, then we end up with perhaps less than ideal care or over triage situations, et cetera. The good news is that in this forward connected environment that we're going to describe, the shared knowledge becomes broad. It becomes accessible. It is literally at your fingertips. So you can take your individual experience, which is important, but you can support that with the shared knowledge that we all should have at that patient's side. And this is the exciting part going forward. So there is a path forward out of these data silos and the ways that we have traditionally responded. And I think sometimes we get really nervous about what does artificial intelligence mean and how can we go forward? And the good news is that we can inform that artificial intelligence that we're going to use with things that are meaningful to us as individuals. There's a whole bunch of research that's come out of the ESO data set. I think this is one of the greatest and most enjoyable parts of my job, quite frankly, is that we make these data freely available. And you can just go to eso.com/data and research and apply to use the data for any research project that you might want to do. And so we encourage people to do that. And as you can see on this slide, the bottom numbers are the only ones I want to talk about there. There have been 63 total peer-reviewed manuscripts when we made this slide. Since we made this slide, we've had 4 more publications. So there's actually now 67. But only 27 of those was somebody from ESO, one of the primary authors. In other words, others are using the data set more than we are, which is exactly what we want to have happen. I want to go through one example of the research and how it could inform an AI model or a bedside decision model as we go forward. So if we think about the trauma triage guidelines, and I know there's new ones from the ACS, and we'll come to that in a minute, but we had enough data to look at these particular guidelines. And the question that we asked ourselves is, based on which one of these steps were utilized to activate the trauma system, how did the patient do? And I think for those of us that have been in the field, we feel pretty good about steps 1 and 2, what I always call the hard findings, right? Your blood pressure is down, there's an obvious penetrating injury, those types of things. And then steps 3 and 4 are more the soft findings. They are the mechanism of injury. They are the special considerations, like is the patient taking an anticoagulant or antiplatelet, those types of things. And the question we always had is, well, what's the predictive property of that? Do I need to go to the trauma center every time there's been a rollover MVC, for an example? And so we looked at that and we said, where in the world of these different steps should we be activating the trauma system? The data we're going to see on the next slide, all patients in there are injury patients. So these are patients that had injury diagnosis in the emergency department, but they met none of the criteria. Right, so they went through all 4 of these steps and they met none of them. And then we'll compare that group to each of the steps. And just one other piece of background, for all EMS transported patients in the United States, all comers for all reasons, the in-hospital mortality is 6%. That's just a walk-around number for you. It's about 6%. So in other words, 94% of the patients that are transported by EMS live to go back home, 6% die in the hospital. So if we look at that then, and we look at this all admitted patients off to the left, these are, again, the injury patients that met no criteria. Their in-hospital mortality was only 3%, less than the normal general population that's transported by EMS. So these are generally young patients with injury that don't meet trauma criteria. Conversely, if you met step 1 and your vital signs were abnormal or your Glasgow Coma score was low, you had an 8% mortality. If you met all or multiple criteria, you had a 10% mortality. But you come here to the mechanism. In other words, if your vitals were okay, you had no special considerations, and you had no penetrating obvious injuries, and you were only activating on mechanism, those patients had an undetectable in-hospital mortality. So as we think about designing a smarter system, so maybe now if we're in the rural community where I grew up in Western North Carolina, you don't have to go bypass the local hospital to the trauma center because we know those mechanism patients are generally going to do pretty well. Maybe they're going to do fine just at the local facility. I'm not advocating people change to local practice, let me be clear, but I'm indicating how we can use these research items that we're bringing forward to start to inform a model that can give us a shared knowledge base when we're out there in the field taking care of patients. So I'm going to hand it back over to Pat, because I think the other piece of getting us to shared knowledge is knowing what actually happened to our patients. So Pat, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Thank you. We did a fantastic, really interesting environment pilot program earlier this year. We started working on it last year. And this, being in EMS and being in clinical education for a big part of my career, this was one of the most meaningful projects I believe that I've been involved in. So we did a pilot. We know, I don't know how many of you, being resource constrained, there's no way that we can go in and review every single outcome, every patient, every chart within our systems. And if you do that, kudos to you, know that you are in the minority there. But even with that, oftentimes those reviews are well after the call, right? They're not, we have a hard time giving that just-in-time feedback unless it was something really unfortunate. So we did a 3-agency pilot. We had some partners that participated with us, also CAPC and UCLA, and we did a 6-week pilot project. And what we did was we allowed these folks to look at their outcomes, to providers in the field, to review their outcomes through our HDE, with our HDE product, and their hospital outcomes. So ran a call, transported that patient to the hospital, got the outcome, the final disposition of that patient back into their EMS system, into EHR, and they were able to review what the hospital said happened to that patient, right? What was that outcome? What we were looking for in this pilot is the primary outcome, the sentiment, how they felt about being able to review that outcome of their patient. And we did a survey to see, what their feelings were. How valuable did they feel that was? Of course, we looked at things like how was the process? Did you find it easy to access? All of those kinds of things. But we really wanted to know if the providers in the field were going to find this valuable, and if they were interested in seeing what that outcome was. And our goal, of course, was the secondary outcome was to be able to provide CE for that review. So it was, we know we have CE requirements. A lot of times that CE, we either find it relevant, timely, valuable to our daily jobs in the field. But imagine getting that feedback within, hours, oftentimes, or days, certainly, of that transport. A lot of times, these days I have a hard time remembering, who I talked to yesterday or what I had for breakfast. So remembering 3 weeks later what I did for that patient, exactly how they presented to me, seeing the outcome or getting some feedback on that may or may not be relevant. This allowed us to provide that just-in-time feedback to the provider so that they could see that outcome. And what did we find out? What we really anticipated we would, which was it was received incredibly well, right? So they got this word cloud is just representative of what we got in those surveys, what the providers that were participating in this pilot said about their experience with it. Improve the outcomes. You can see self-affirming, clinical knowledge, inform, repeat patients. So it's, we think of this as being not just, did I make a mistake on that, but reinforcing the decisions that we made and the care that we provided, that it was, it was the right thing to do. And then going even further, providers realized that this could inform future protocols and care decisions that they made. So really understand the patients, and those are some words and things that stood out from this. We were able to use, we have a tool that is, it's called Pendo. It's a product analysis tool, and it allows us to get not only immediate feedback, it's a behavioral tool, so we can see the way that providers are interacting with our software, but it also allows us to get real-time feedback. So, as people were reviewing, as providers were reviewing and participating in this pilot, they were able to give us feedback immediately within the tool on their experience. And so we felt like that provided a really relevant, accurate, representation about their experience. So we're really excited about it. We're excited to be able to release this, on a more broad level to folks that feel like we really like it to be relevant and beneficial to everybody in the field.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. And just for those in the audience that want to know the technical side of this, this is 15 minutes of continuing education credit per outcome review, and that is consistent with the future plans from National Registry. We walked in partnership with National Registry and CAPC on that, so that's a really nice opportunity to get up to 8 hours of CE a year from reviewing your outcomes. The other piece of research I want us to think about that are going to, I think, really contributes to the shared knowledge, takes what Pat just described, and then we take it all the way back to the dispatch center. So if we think about that first example that we use, where dispatch gets a lot of information, we send out one little code, and then EMS does their part and so forth, this really tries to integrate and tie all that together. And the question from this research project was basically, can we determine at dispatch who's going to need time critical interventions? Some of that research has been done before. What's unique about this particular project is we also follow them all the way through to the ED disposition and diagnosis to make sure that we could safely, number one, activate for those that need time critical intervention, but also start really having that conversation about the other basically 70–80% of the calls that don't require any of that, so that we can have an appropriate response. So most folks in the field kind of understand this, but just to be really clear, the dispatch center has a protocol, right? And they bring it in, and I was the medical director for Wake EMS for 12.5 years. And every year we would sit down and we would fill in this table, right? And there are 470 some odd combinations that come out of this. And you would sit down and say, for a 10 Delta 1, I want a first response and a BLS resource and an ALS resource and everybody go license hire. And for an Alpha, I want to send it to nurse advice, right? And you would program these things in, and then statically they would sit there for the next year. Our goal with this research is to say we can be much more dynamic than that. And we can adjust what we send based on the resources that are available in the system, based on the weather, based on are we in a pandemic or not, et cetera, dynamically, rather than simply having these static tables. That's really where we want to head, right? And so we had 8 partnership agencies here that helped us. Johns Hopkins helped us actually complete the research. And this is the largest linked outcomes paper ever published. We had over 500,000 linked patients from the 911 code that was established all the way through to their hospital disposition. And the question that we asked, first of all, is just, do the codes, Omega all the way up to Echo, are they generally predictive like we think they would be? And then secondarily, we asked the question, are there calls that are obviously safe to hold? And are there calls that, if you're low on resources or what have you, and can we identify them prospectively, and what's the best way to do that? So we've got just a couple of those outcomes to talk about, and then we'll really kind of move into the AI world that's coming for us in EMS. So the good news is that the protocols functioned generally as designed. So if you look at the blue bars there, that is EMS time critical interventions. And the group of 8 medical directors participating in this call, plus our Hopkins colleagues, did a survey, and we got the list, and it's a list that most people would be familiar with. Do you give epinephrine? Do they need CPR, defibrillation, et cetera, the time critical thing? And what you can see is that it generally functions as designed. Omegas and alphas need 1% or less of that. Echoes, almost half, 40%, need some ultra-time critical intervention. Likewise, at the hospital, you can see that those march their way up as well. And we were very conservative. This was the first paper, so we were very conservative about the hospital. If you had any even hint of something time critical, we put you in the bucket, but you can see it also progressed up very nicely. So it functioned as designed. So then we came back and said, what about if we say there are less than 1% ultra time critical for EMS or less than 5% in the ED, that call is potentially safe to hold. And if you look at that, what you see is there 8% of the calls can actually be held at dispatch with a high degree of confidence that there's not a time critical thing going on. We can adjust this, and if you just let that ultra time critical rise up to 2%, that number gets much bigger, right? So you can move these up or down depending on the dynamics of your system. What is really interesting here is that not all of these are in the alpha bucket. For example, one of the mythbuster things that comes from this research is we're always taught to worry about abdominal pain, right? And is abdominal pain actually going to mask as something else? Well, it turns out that Bravo abdominal pains and even Charlie abdominal pains are pretty safe to hold. They still need to be evaluated, still need to get out there, but they don't get time critical nearly as much as we might have thought based on this one paper. Obviously, never change practice on one paper, but it's an interesting finding. The other part that I found even more interesting, though, is that not all of the alphas are safe to hold. So a very common thing in the dispatch world is to say we're low on resources, hold all the alphas until we can get our resources back available. And as it turns out, the chief complaint actually matters. And so in this particular case, if you hear the word allergic reaction, it doesn't matter what codes you put with it. A large percent of those patients need an ultra-time critical intervention. So it is probably worth reviewing to say, do we really hold alphas or do we look at the chief complaints? And you don't want to hold your allergic reactions, even if they're coded alpha. It looks, at least from this one paper. So we can start taking the research that we're doing and then move this into a pathway forward. And that's really what we want to talk about now. This notion of trying to move away from AI, or we don't want to have anything generated from ChatGPT, I think is just a fool's errand, right? This is coming. So what we want to do is be responsible as an industry, use our own internal research to inform these models so that the shared knowledge that we have at the bedside is something that we can rely on. And I think that's really important for us. And so this is where we hope to head, right? We want to design the system with desired outcomes. We want to take the bottlenecks out, and we want to balance that individual experience with an appropriate, in your hands, shared knowledge that's available to you at the bedside at the time you need to make decisions. So rather than what we saw before, this is the new world that we envision. One of those is that the dispatch is integrated and it's a continuous data flow. So you're not just you're going to a 1-alpha-1, right? You are live with the dispatcher. The dispatcher is receiving much better information than simply a voice call, right? They're getting information from a smart device. They're getting information from a camera. All of the different ways that information, vehicle telematics, can come into that 911 center. The initial response is either virtual or in person. It is patient-centered, and this information is constantly flowing up to the inevitable place where the patient's going to go. Maybe that's an alternative disposition. Maybe that's air ambulance. Maybe that's ground transport, whatever it may be. But rather than having the data silos that we described at the beginning, we can do this with Uber today. We certainly should be able to do this with our patient-centered approach and have that information available. We can have real-time information about patient offload times. We can have real-time information about where are our STEMI patients going, how are they doing, and hold our receiving partners accountable for excellent care. And there's one really nice thing about EMS care that's not true necessarily elsewhere in the House of Medicine. If you think about EMS care for those time critical patients, and we're going to talk also about the non-time critical in a moment, but for those that are time critical, providing the best care is also the least expensive way to care for those patients. There is nothing more expensive to the healthcare system, forget the ethics of wanting to do the right thing. Just if we think about strictly financially, we need to do the best thing for patients with a stroke. We need to do the best thing for patients with a STEMI because their lifelong care depends on us getting this right. And so the notion that where do we take this STEMI patient? Do they need to go to the primary stroke center, the comprehensive stroke center, all of those things? We need to have that shared knowledge available for you as the provider at the bedside so that you can get the patient to the right place the first time. We've got to not bury our head in the sand, so to speak. The other piece that this integration allows is it allows us to have at our fingertips information that keeps us equitable. It makes sure that the best care that we provide is provided to all of the patients that we see. And the best inequity measure today may not be the best inequity measure tomorrow, but we can help make sure that there are not unintended things that happen depending on where we respond, what time of day it is, all of the things that can get us out of an equitable level of care. And then the final thing is thinking about how we can have impact with this integrated data in real time. And I think for me as a clinician, I will say, the first time that you logged into an electronic medical record and it popped up and gave you some odd warning, or it said, wait a minute, did you think about this? I had my doubts, right? I was, wait a minute, I know what I'm doing. I don't need this thing to tell me stuff. And within that first shift, I was humbled by it, right? I understood there is no reason for me to be trying to process all of this. There is a shared knowledge base that could pop up and say, hey, this patient has an allergy to the medicine you're getting ready to write for. Might you think of something different? And that's the simplest bedside decision support. But we in EMS have not had that exposure very much at the bedside, and it's coming really soon. And I think this is where we're headed. So I'm going to just kind of set the table for just a minute to talk about how we want to frame our discussion for the second half of our talk here today. The first of those is, what do we mean by these terms? And this is an article I think that really helps give us some very basic definitions so we're talking about the same things, right? Artificial intelligence is this very broad category, and that lots of things can fit into that. From the EMS perspective, those research projects that we just discussed are now feeding a machine learning algorithm, meaning that it's just a bunch of math. And we're going to go through a couple of fun clinical examples. I'll nerd out for a little bit so some of you, can make fun of me, but we're going to go through a couple of clinical examples of how this machine learning piece is actually really helpful for us. Then the deep learning is actually where people get a little nervous, right? Which is where it's not just extra math with things that you're feeding into the machine, but the machine itself starts to learn from other things that have already been fed into it, which leads us eventually to generative AI, right? This notion of, write me a paper about whatever, and then the next thing you know, you've got a 3-page paper that's actually really readable and very nice. This is the framework that we're going to use for the rest of our discussion about where things are going for us. And we're going to focus on how we come to trust this. We as humans have to come to trust this. And the way that we get there is understanding how it works, right? And understanding what it is that we feed into this to make it work. So the notion of epistemology is, how do we as humans accept something as knowledge? And two things have to be true. We have to know that it's the truth, and we have to believe it. And where truth and belief overlap is where knowledge comes from. And so part of the reason I think that many of us, myself included initially, had this hesitancy about a thing in my hand or on the desktop trying to tell me how to take care of patients is I had trouble with the belief part, right? I couldn't argue with the facts. I couldn't get myself into the belief of it. And the way that I think all of us get there is getting a greater understanding of how this actually works in the background. And that's what we want to talk about. So this is just amazing to me as a clinician. This came out earlier this year in the New England Journal. And it was just a little article in the New England Journal. It didn't get this huge fanfare that I thought it would. They actually have cured sickle cell disease. The ability to go in and do a medical intervention and have patients have 6-12 months of freedom from sickle cell. The pace at which medical knowledge is moving now requires us to be humble and accept the fact there's no way we can keep up with all of it, right? It's almost humorous now to get the hard copy of the New England Journal once a week and then try to even digest one of the articles that's in there and bring it forward to medical practice. The pace is just too great. And this is so true in ChatGPT, right? This is the number of parameters in billions that were in that just starting back in 2018. And look at the difference in the 3 years from 2020 to 2023. And that's gone up yet again in 2024. There's just no way that we as humans can keep up with it. And in the New England Journal, speaking of, they gave, and the domains here are not important. The point here is they looked at all of the different ways that AI has entered into medicine. And they said, is any of it at maturity? So I circled that off to the end. None of it is at maturity. Medicine is behind many of the other domains in the world when it relates to how AI is influencing it. And we're going to have to catch up, and we're going to catch up pretty quickly, I think. So the goal here is very similar to the 2050 EMS agenda, right? AI has to have those components for us to believe it. And it's going to begin with our instructors, right? The world is going to change when we can help people as they enter into our profession understand how this works. This notion of banning ChatGPT is never going to work. I said at the beginning, I just want to call that out. That's not going to work. For people that are really, really interested in this, I encourage you to read this book. I have no conflicts of interest. I don't know the publisher or any of that. But it really takes you through how AI is going to change the way that the world works in a way that is very uplifting. And one of the examples they use is this classroom concept. And so this is the Wake EMS classroom where they're doing the EMT and paramedic education. And if you think about trying to keep everybody in this classroom on the same page as an instructor, that's very difficult to do. These people enter in with different backgrounds, experiences. You're talking below the level of some, above the level of others. And it's that old-fashioned education that we're all kind of used to, but it's hard to move along. What actually can come from ChatGPT, though, is that each individual student can have their own virtual tutor. And it's already built in. I encourage you to experiment with it, but you can go in and basically say, I want to have competence in pick the topic. And then it starts asking you questions to find out where you are. And then when it gets to the edge of your knowledge, it stops. And it says, you need to read this, or you need to watch this video or have this experience. And so you as the individual student have learning that is designed for you as the individual. The way that we're going to teach students in the very near future is a lot more like this than it is that classroom picture that we just saw. And once we have students coming out with that, then they're going to expect the same thing when they're at the bedside for their patients. And that's got to come very quickly. So there are some changes. The first is we're putting voice to text for EMS. We're putting AI in hospitals all over the place. And this is one of my favorite slides. I'm not going to name the educational institution, but this was on their social media account this year to say it's time to come back to class. And for those that have not gone through the paramedic program, this is how do you calculate a dopamine drip, right? I would never in a million years put into me, my family member, or anybody else something I calculated that way, right? But that was the test. And for those that have been around for a while, you had to be able on the sheet in the middle of the night, calculate a dopamine drip. Pat, how many dopamine drips do you calculate on the bed sheet in the middle of the night? One or two. Mm-hmm. There's no place for math in medicine, right? We should not be doing this anymore. As a matter of fact, we've got self-driving cars. Why can we not also have our medications calculated, have all of these things done for us? And it doesn't mean that you're not a good clinician, right? the badge should be the patient did well, not I was able to do these, heroic calculations that don't need to be done at the bedside. So the last little piece I want to talk about is the machine learning and the changes that are coming to the practice. And I think that it is a good day, right? These are good things that are coming. And so I'm going to spend our last 5 or 10 minutes here before we go to questions, talk about a true case example, and how I think this case existed prior to a lot of this bedside decision support coming. But if we can imagine how this case would have been so much easier and better if we had it. So the true case, I was medical director in Raleigh. There was a gentleman that was walking into a place of business in July and collapsed in the parking lot. And the good news for him, it was a witnessed event. There was actually an AED in the building, but somebody else called 911, and the fire department actually arrived with their AED before they could get the AED out of the building. Gentleman was in VFib, CPR was in progress. Fire department fired their AED twice. EMS fired their AED twice, or excuse me, their regular defibrillator, got a pulse back. Great. So they are between about equidistance from 3 different facilities that could handle a post-cardiac arrest. They got en route to what was by a very small amount, the closest one, and noticed that there was blood running down the stretcher. Well, as it turns out, the gentleman had collapsed so hard that he had opened a head wound, and he was still bleeding from his head wound in this parking lot. And then as he came around, he started trying to come up off of the stretcher in a very forceful way. And so they finally rolled him over, and he had 3rd-degree burns on his shoulders, buttocks, and ankles from lying in a parking lot in Raleigh in July having CPR on a blacktop parking lot. So he had an open head wound, had a STEMI on his EKG, he was post-cardiac arrest, and he had burns that were fairly significant over parts of his body. And the crew was like, now what do we do, right? Where do we go? Do we go to a trauma center? Do we go to the STEMI center? How do we handle this particular case? And so the world is all about probabilities, right? What is the probability of this versus that, and where do we need to take this patient? That's really hard to calculate in your head in real time while you're sitting there caring for this patient in front of you. But as we said before, our shared knowledge, we could actually come forward and talk about that. So this is the nerdy out part that I warned you about. So for those that aren't ready to go nerd out with me, just bear with me. It won't last but a minute. Those that are will really enjoy this part. The notion that things have independent odds or independent probability is generally not true in life. It is true with the roulette table. So don't be fooled by where the thing landed last on the thing, in the casino. That is truly independent odds, right? But otherwise, almost everything we do, what's going to happen next depends on what happened before in some way. And so this Presbyterian minister and mathematician quantified this and made a formula that basically said the likelihood of the next thing is in some way dependent on what just happened, which makes a lot of sense. But again, it's very difficult for us as human beings to do this in real time. It's much better to do this before you encounter somebody that's got burns and a STEMI and an open head wound and is a post-cardiac arrest, and trying to figure out what the best thing to do for them is. And so this is my favorite Mark Twain quote, right? It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And I think we in the House of Medicine and in EMS in particular sometimes have a really difficult time thinking about how to get away from a sacred cow. So I'm going to use a really easy example, and then we'll come back to talk about that case in the parking lot and take some questions. So this paper was published back in the 1970s to talk about how to take that formula that Bayes had and put it at the bedside, so that you could actually use it to make clinical decisions. So we're going to talk about something very benign, a case of the sore throat, and how a sore throat could be evaluated, and then we'll come back to our complex case. So don't worry about the nomogram. I'll show you how that works, but it's just that Bayes formula put onto a graph is really what it is. But not all test results are the same, right? So if we think about the characteristics of a strep test, these numbers are what feed that formula that we just had. For those that want to do this after, I'll actually do the math with you. We'll draw the little lines and show you how it all works. But just trust me, we put these numbers in the formula. So one patient comes in to see you and they've got a low-grade fever. It's painful to swallow. They've got swollen tonsils. They've got a little exudate on the tonsils. You look at that and you're like, that patient's got strep throat. You don't need a test to tell you if that patient's got strep throat. They've probably got it. But let's say you order that test anyway. You had a 95% pre-test probability that that patient had strep throat just by their clinical presentation, the prior thing. Then you do the test. Well, even if the test is negative, they still have a 30% chance of having strep throat. So you will see sometimes you go to the doctor and like, I'm not going to do the test. I'm just going to give you the antibiotics because I think you have strep throat. And you're like, well, I want to have a strep test. Well, even if it's negative, you've got a 30% chance of having it. We can't run the risk of all the complications that come from untreated strep throat, so we're going to treat it, right? What happened before influences what happens after. Conversely, if somebody comes in and they're like, their throat doesn't really look has strep, you're not really sure what this is, then the test has a real impact. Because if it is negative, they have a less than 0.5% chance of having strep throat. And even if it's positive, it's still 50-50, but you probably still won't treat it. That just goes to show that same test is a very different outcome depending on your pre-test probabilities, right? And so we need to have this available to us at the bedside in EMS, right? So that we know how to do that going forward. So now let's go back to our patient in the parking lot in July. If we think about that patient, they had 100% post-test probability of having a STEMI, right? The classic thing, they fell over. We had a high suspicion of STEMI because they had a VFib arrest. And then you put them on the EKG and it shows classic findings. That is the most time critical thing, right? So that patient needs to go right now. They were not taking anticoagulants, but from that fall, there's still a 25% chance that they have some bleeding in their brain. That's the second most important thing. And if that CT is negative, then you're out of the woods. The last one is they do have burns, but we know that's the least time sensitive. It's going to take weeks for those burns to heal. So the order of operation is dictated by the thing that happened, what you know about the patient now, and what their next steps are going to be. So what ultimately happened to that patient? That patient went to the near STEMI center that was not a trauma center. And if you've ever been to a STEMI center that's not a trauma center with a patient with burns and an open head wound and all that, you know it can be an event. The good news is cardiology came right down and said, nobody's going to fix a head bleed. Nobody's going to fix these burns until that STEMI is taken care of. So they went straight to the cath lab, from the cath lab to the CT scanner, stayed overnight, and then went to the burn center for their treatment. And the patient did great, right? But it was a complex thing that was really fortuitous that it worked out. What we want to have is a system that's designed that takes care of that for you. So right there on the screen in your hand, it said, go to this hospital and tell them to do this, this, and this, because that's what all of our pre and post test probabilities in our shared knowledge tell us to do. So there is a good way forward here. We are tearing down these silos day by day. And I think you will see that just like that ChatGPT increase that you saw, is going to also be true in medicine. We've got lawyers that are embracing ChatGPT. So for goodness sakes, we can start embracing this as well. And so this is going to change the way we approach the world, right? It's going to change it for the instructor. It's going to change it for the student. And it's going to change us for our practice. The good news is we're going in with our eyes wide open. We can do our own research. We can feed this with our own data. And it will be something that I think we all will look back 18 months from now and say, how did we ever do it without all of the support that's coming from true evidence-based bedside practice decision support? So we really appreciate the opportunity to share our thoughts here, and we want to make sure we had time for questions. So we'll stop here, and Steve, if there's questions or comments for us, we're happy to entertain it.
All right. Thank you, Brent, and thank you, Pat. Great presentation. And yes, as Brent just mentioned, everyone, it's time for Q&A. So please send in those questions using that Q&A icon that you can see right there on your screen. And we'll roll through a couple questions here before we wrap up for the day. First question here for you presenters is as follows. How do you see AI helping in the field when deciding which calls need the most urgent response?
So, Pat, I'll take the first dive of this, and then let you reflect on it as well. I think the most important thing is the ability to enter data in real time. So we can't have good bedside decision support, if you will, from an AI engine if we are in the old mode of take care of the patient, get to the hospital, and then start documenting and talking about the patient care report. So the threshold that's coming is the ability to very easily enter data in real time as you're caring for the patient. I think once we get past that, which is actually technically pretty easy to do, easy for me to say easy. The engineers are going to say I'm lost my mind, but once we get past that hurdle, then I think the ability to do bedside decision support will be right with us. Pat, any other thoughts?
No, I agree. It's that and integrating the data, having all of the data and looking at it, to inform those decisions. I think is and not having everything existing in those silos, the whole thing from dispatch all the way through, is going to be key for that.
All right, thank you. Next question here. With so many new technologies being introduced in the industry, how can agencies adapt without adding too much complexity to the workflows?
That is a fantastic question. Go ahead, Pat.
Oh, that's a challenge that we face every day, right? Some of it is those complex workflows. It's learning. I think with all of this, when you think about AI and you think about, I look back over my career and some of the things that we did at the beginning of my career. I won't say what, because that would be dating me way too much for today. But some of the things that we did that just when those theories, those, policies, protocols, things changed and they seemed absolutely unrealistic, like didn't make any sense to me, had a hard time adjusting to them. And now they're, second nature. I mean, it's just, I wouldn't even think twice about it. So I think a lot of our trepidation, a lot of the fear around a lot of these things is really a lack of understanding. It's a lack of, just not knowing, fear of the unknown, making ourselves knowledgeable about these things. And I think with the complexity, it's going to be a couple of things. It's taking it in small chunks, taking it in small bites, and just getting familiar with it, getting used to it, in using all of the data to figure out what's valuable and relevant, and not, adding a new tool or switching to something just for the sake of doing it. It's really having the majority of our tools and resources integrated into central location where we can pull that information and utilization. Brent?
Yeah, the other thing to add to that is that it is incumbent upon us that are industry partners that create the technologies that will facilitate this to also be very mindful of the workflows that we are creating. And one of the beauties of doing this in the world of AI that's coming before us is just like the student of the future that's going to have their own personal ChatGPT tutor, I think, in the classroom very soon. We should also have adaptive workflows that are generated based on the circumstances that are there on the scene, to make it easy, whether you're treating the STEMI patient or whether you're looking for an alternative destination for a patient that may need to go to telemedicine. We should have adaptable flows so that it's more voice data entry than it is manual data entry. It collects things in real time. It's our job to make sure that this is easier rather than hard as well.
All right, thank you. Next question, moving along here. How can agencies use research like the studies discussed today to improve how we handle calls from start to finish, especially when improving patient outcomes?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first piece is we are going to be replicating some of these studies. We've already had requests from other agencies that weren't involved in that original research. I always hesitate to make any change based on, one paper. It's a big paper, 500,000 patients, but we still want to do that. Once you have that replicated in a way that you feel comfortable with it, then it is the same change management that you often go through, which is we're going to be either sending fewer or more resources to calls that yesterday had something different, right? So getting all the stakeholders around the table to have that first pass and then giving the feedback 30, 60, 90 days later on your success, then you can start doing the change management that, throughout the process. But I think it is so much better now than when I was a medical director, meaning the specialty has matured. We are looking at our own research, which makes it a lot easier to justify making a change rather than implying because this worked in the ICU, it will probably work in the field, which is kind of where we were before. But the specialty has matured to the point now that we have our own body of research that we can use. So I think that's a big key.
Okay. Next question. Are there any specific challenges EMS agencies face when it comes to resource management in rural versus urban settings?
Yes, indeed. And I think, Pat, I won't get your thoughts on this as well. The one thing that I'll observe off the top is hospital destination is probably one of the most difficult in the rural areas. When do you take what the very few EMS resources that are available in that community and move a patient to an urban center or to a tertiary care center? And we want to be so evidence-based with that so that we can justify why that happens. Or when do you call for an air ambulance? Those are, in my mind, one of the biggest complexities of providing EMS in the rural space, is knowing when to leave. And if you do leave, how can you do it and minimize the impact to your community, because you just don't have the level of resource often just by number of vehicles that you might have in an urban area. Pat, other things, reflections there?
Sure. I worked at my first job was in a very rural community and staffed mostly by volunteers. And so there's creativity there that you have to get, and buy-in, commitment. But I also think it's being able to show there's a lot of value in things that you do that are not necessarily related to, a transport or an EMS call. And I think it's being able to show that, having the tools and, being knowledgeable, understanding your service and knowing what's available, even, like grants. And there's some resources that, are not right out in front of you, but they are available to you to help with staffing and equipment and things like that. But I think it's the configuration of your whole service, from your staffing model, even if that's volunteers, to how you report and the tools you use, combining all of those things to help you be successful. It's definitely challenging in the rural areas. And partnering with your neighbors, right? Like those response models across territories is really important.
Okay. We got time for another quick one here. Brent, you were making 2 points to a bit earlier that I'd kind of like to tie together here. You said that one of the first times you used AI, GPS, that type of thing, you're like, I don't really need this thing. But shortly thereafter, you said, this is not going away. And I think that sort of speaks to a lot of people out there who have that feeling. So what would you recommend to people who are kind of experiencing the same way that you were, that this is potentially, something that you look at, I don't really need this thing, but it could be a potentially good tool. It's definitely not going away. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thanks for asking. To me, the first thing you do is, and I have no interest in ChatGPT, there's no conflict here. I would go this afternoon and ask a question. I want a 1-page paper about whatever topic it is that is near and dear to your heart, and just watch it do what it does. I think it demystifies it a little bit. I have the honor of serving on many peer review boards for academic journals. And I remember not very long ago, everybody had to sign a thing at the end that said, I did not use AI / ChatGPT to create this journal article. That's not there anymore. The other thing that's there is I attest that I did use that, and I have verified the veracity of it by my own overread, or whatever that phrase is. once you've used it a couple of times, then you start to see it's a tool. It's not going to take over the world, but it's a tool, and it's a tool that we ought to use to make our lives easier. So that would be, to me, that's how it gets better and demystified. Just jump in and use the thing.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time here, and it's just about time for us to wrap up. But Brent and Pat, I want to thank you for presenting with us today. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thanks to ESO as well for being our sponsors for today's webinar. We appreciate them, and I want to thank Pat and Brent before we wrap up here. Unfortunately, got to go, everybody, but have a great rest of your day.